Lachenko, why don't you start us off?
Well, today we have our annual spending control limits discussion for WSSC. This is an annual process that was established back in 1994 by both counties. I will note this is something that the counties established. This is not required in state law. So it's our own process that we've got here. And the intent is to try to come to agreement with Prince George's County by November 1st of each year in order to give WSSC budget guidance as it establishes its budget, which it does over the winter, and then ultimately submits to the counties by March 1st. There are 4 limits within the spending control limits process that we talk about. There's the maximum average rate increase, there's debt service, new debt, and then total water and sewer operating expenses. And I do want to clarify, this is a process of establishing ceilings. So the budget process itself, which is at this point only forecasts, not actual budget development, can certainly go in any number of other directions and go below those numbers, and it has in past years. And also, this does not limit what the councils can do as part of its final budget deliberations next May. So this is really intended to provide guidance to WSSC, and primarily because, unlike other department budgets, the WSSC proposed budget under state law is a default budget if the two councils cannot agree in the end. So we do like to see a reasonable budget proposal up front to give the counties some assurance that we are in a reasonable ballpark going forward. And I think that the process has worked reasonably well over the last number of years. Even when the councils have not come to full agreement, the councils have still provided a range to WSSC, which the councils have ultimately been able to live with through the budget process. So as part of this process, WSSC staff develop a 6-year forecast with a number of revenue and expenditure assumptions, which we can get into the gory details as the committee wants. And we have a bi-county staff working group consisting of myself on this side, as well as executive staff, and then our counterparts on the Prince George's side, to go through these issues, identify alternative scenarios to what we call a base case scenario, and we go from there. Our council held a public hearing on October 2nd. Basically, the public hearing introduced the base case to the public, and then we have our committee review, council discussion, and depending on where we end up and where Prince George's ends up, then we try to reconcile. We also have the benefit of the county executive's recommendation, which came in earlier this week. We can talk about that. And we also coincidentally have the benefit of the Prince George's committee review, which was this morning. So WSSC can speak to that as well today. So that's sort of a general summary of the process.
The county executive's recommendation is what?
The county executive's recommendation was a 5% rate increase scenario. And the reason I say scenario is because there's a lot of elements within that. And we also have, if you recall, a change in rate structure that will occur in FY20. So the 5% number equates to the current rate structure. And then it would get reallocated based on the new rate structure, which we can talk about.
Staff's recommendation?
My staff recommendation also happens to be the 5% scenario. And that also happens to be the Prince George's County staff's recommended scenario, and what the TH&E committee, their equivalent committee reviewing this, came to agreement this morning. So currently, we at the staff level, and at least at the Prince George's committee level, we are at a 5% scenario.
Ms. Foster, welcome. And everybody, please introduce yourselves.
I'm Eloise Foster, for the record, and of course joining me is Commissioner Howard Dennis, and then we have both Deputy General Managers, Joe Mantua and Joe Beach, and on the far end is our Budget Director, who is Letitia Carolina Powell.
Welcome. So we have county executive, council staff, Prince George's council staff, and Prince George's County committee all saying 5%. You going to be able to live with 5%? Because it certainly seems like that's where we're headed.
Reluctantly, yes, we will. It would require some additional reductions that we'll work with the staff on, but yes.
And I do want to clarify that the WSSC Commission has not formally voted on any numbers. This was developed through the staff review process, And so they obviously go through their own budget development and have to approve a proposed budget early next year.
Got it. Ms. Florine, I know this is always a topic of great interest for you.
Yeah, well, I'm not going along with this. I think 5% is too much, and apparently Mr. Leggett agrees that that should be the ceiling and not the bottom. What?
We always establish just the ceiling.
Yeah, I know. But, you know, the assumptions about compensation increases, the assumption that rates are always going to go up 5%. I mean, this is built into this structure. I know prices were paid for taking the no rate increase approach in the 90s, and I appreciate everybody's goodwill in this regard, but I'd like to know from the commission, what are you doing to cut operating costs? I understand we have huge debt costs. What I don't know is what you're doing with respect to operating expenses, particularly in your contracts. A lot of this, how much of your operations are conducted through contract agreements with separate businesses, or is it's not all WSSC people?
We'd have to get back to you with the specific figure, but you're correct. A very large portion of our work, both in the capital budget and
It's
operations.
contractual.
Mainly is contractual, but
Delivery of
mainly in
service.
capital. I think on the operating side, it's mainly WSSC employees.
Well, what kind of scrutiny are you exercising over how those contracts are entered into? Do they have built-in compensation increases? I mean, is that what they're based on? You know, this is, let's see, well, I've been here 16 years. Let's see, Keith, so what's the cumulative increase that I've participated in over that time? It's a wicked lot, I think we can agree on.
Rate increases since
2003, I guess it-
2002, which
Well, I wasn't in, the 2002 would have been approved by the Private Council, so
Right, but-
2003 on, that's
but-
a lot.
from about, I mean, I did actually look at those
Oh,
numbers.
thank you.
It's gone up, and this is compounded, of course.
Yeah, of course,
It's gone up about 138%.
138%.
I do
Is
want
that
to,
something, wait, that's 138%. I'm not proud of that.
Okay, let me,
So are you proud of that?
Here's what I would say, and I'm going to actually turn it over to Joe for the details. You know, I don't have to tell this group that certainly this has been a challenging year and a challenging several years in the water business. The challenge that we face, of course, is that water consumption has been flat for the past 20 years. And although that's the case, we have environmental compliances that we have to reach with the IT, the labor costs. All of those costs continue to grow. They continue to grow at a substantially higher rate than rate increases have been. And I think as an agency, certainly the finance department, the asset management office, the engineering and construction group, all of those units have met. They've undertook a very extensive review about our short-term and our long-term capital and operating budgets. And over the years, and especially this year, they have tried to put into place a plan that recognizes that we have to have a sustainable budget. We have to have a budget that's going to be affordable for our ratepayers. And in the end, we've got to continue to make some progress toward renewed and replacement of our infrastructure. So,
Well, I understand that's the party line, and you've all done a great job of articulating that over the years. And I know the last thing we want are for pipes to explode, or, you know, we know that we have a lot of replacement obligations. But I do wonder how much the commission has done to really evaluate its costs.
Okay,
You
I-
talk about personnel costs. Well, yeah.
yeah, okay,
I do want,
I mean, the assumptions about how that part works.
sure.
How we evaluate our procurement system. This is an issue, a base function issue that, because we keep agreeing to everything, there's very little incentive to hold a hard line on all this. If I were you, I would say, well, those councils will go along with it, pick a low number, and they will. Well, that's always happened. I mean, I've been at the table on all this, and I mean, that is the environment in which we've been operating for many years.
and
I'd like to talk about our cost reduction and cost control programs.
That'd be great, thank you.
So as the chair had mentioned, over the summer, we did take a look at our CIP and our debt costs as well. What we wanted to make sure was we structured a long-term plan for sustainable CIP. The result of that is we reduced debt in the FY20, planned debt, FY20 to 25 CIP, compared to the 19 to 24 by over $400 million. Some of the reductions there included our water main reconstruction costs, which in FY20 we're reducing by about $46 million. And we are reducing the number of miles replaced from 45 to 25. And the reason we're doing that, not just because of the savings, is we're stepping back and we're looking at how we assess and identify those pipes we're going to replace. We're right now piloting a few different technologies. One is a technology that goes with fire hydrants that uses some sound waves or to identify where the leaks are. Another goes with valves, and then we've looked at satellite imaging as well. And we believe by identifying where the leaks are, we can use our leak detection and leak and water main replacement efforts a lot more effectively as well. So that's one thing, okay? The second is we, for a number of reasons, we moved the Potomac Submerged Channel Intake Project out past FY25. We need to complete the Potomac Consent Decree work before we do that. That was about $81 million as well. So the biggest part of our operating budget is actually our debt service, which is about over 37%. By comparison with the county, that's about 10 to 11%. We're capital intensive, utilities are like that. So with those debt reductions we have in 20 to 25, we reduced debt service in that period by about $99 million. We're also, beginning in FY25, are going to change our method of issuing debt so that we're paying our interest down more quickly. So between the period of 20 to 50, we're going to produce another $177 million in savings. Now, you mentioned procurement. We've had since FY13 what we call strategic sourcing teams. What those are cross-functional teams that involves procurement, engineering, construction, other departments, and we look at what's the supply chain, what sort of negotiation techniques are we using, and we track it procurement by procurement. In the capital budget, we've identified about $53 million in savings. In the operating budget, it's about over $30 million in savings. Recall in the FY18 budget, we asked for, I believe, a 6% increase. What was approved was a 3.5% increase. We identified about $17 million in our reductions in our budget in chemicals and in other areas, which we've never restored to the budget as well. We've had no increase in our personnel complement since FY17. We currently have a position freeze where we're managing all of our hiring as well. We've looked at our group insurance plan design, similar to the county. We've implemented an AGWIC program, increased the employee contribution since FY17
Do you
about
have a defined benefit plan?
Yes, we do.
And why? That's the most expensive one around. You still have that?
Right, yes. It's somewhat different than the counties, but it is a defined benefit program, similar to most jurisdictions like MCPS, park and planning.
Not the county?
Not for Montgomery County civilian employees since
Put that on the list to look
1994.
at.
Almost done with this. We've also have made changes to our workers' compensation programs. We've reduced the lost workday by 50%. We've reduced costs since calendar year 16 by over 50%. We've reduced our overtime by $1 million per year since FY17 and have kept it at that reduced level. So we have a number of ongoing cost containment and cost control programs. It's very important to the general manager, very important to the chair and the commissioners, being the former state budget director. She's always asked a lot of tough questions of us on the budget. So it may seem to you like we don't have the incentive, we don't care. I can tell you, since having been there for over 2 years now, there is a big focus on that and a continuing effort to control operating and capital costs.
Thank you. Now, I'm not saying, I don't mean to suggest that you don't care. But what you've described, primarily on your CIP work, is you just push these things to the front end of the Titanic, or maybe probably the front end of the Titanic. You just moved them around. You've moved the deck chairs around. And continue to have the same or increased fiscal obligation. So actually, You're just delivering fewer services for a higher price. That's what the math sounds like to me. I know that was at the early part of your presentation there. And look, I appreciate, I know you're good people. I know you're extraordinarily competent. But I have problems with the assumptions here, so I'm not going to support this. I know it's a 2-to-1 vote, but you can put me down as the one, Keith.
So I just remind my colleagues, if we were to go with a different number than Prince George's County, a lower number than Prince George's County, and maintain that position, then under the state law, the 6% would actually kick in.
Well,
So,
if I may respond, it's because of what I did last year that they ended up with the number they ended up with, because we ended up getting a lower number than what had initially been
What
proposed.
typically happens if we had two different numbers between Prince George's and
But this is just the beginning.
generally, if the past is prologue, WSSC would submit a budget that's within the range of the two typically. So if we were at 5, if we were at 4.5 and Prince George's is at 5 or something like that, they're probably going to come in between that. But that doesn't preclude what happens in the spring.
Right.
Where you could go higher, lower, there's no constraint on that. This is purely to provide guidance to WSSC on their budget development only.
This is only the marker point, yeah.
And the intent is to try to keep us from having a really ridiculous proposal that, through the default provision of the state budget or the state law, could theoretically happen. So that's, I don't want to overstate what this does. That's really its primary purpose, is to get us in the a decent ballpark for the budget.
Mr. Hucker?
Sounds like Ms. Florine knows me very well.
It's only been a couple of years.
Joe, remind me, what's the timeline for the completion of the Potomac consent decree?
I believe we're required to have that.
2026.
FY '26?
Yeah. The long-term improvements are 2026.
How's it going?
You want to hit the picture?
Oh, sorry. Good afternoon, Joe Mantua. It's going fine. We're currently working with our consultant. We will be meeting with MDE very soon to lay out the latest advancements and where we are with the revisions to the plan, and we'll have that information shortly.
What are those revisions in a nutshell?
This will be, they've come up with a new approach that is going to meet the schedule. We are looking at some slightly additional costs to what we had previously programmed, and that's something that we'll be negotiating with MDE.
What kind of percentage increased cost? Generally, ballpark.
Trying to remember, I think we're at, where were we? About 15 to 20% from the original estimates.
And what's the next step in MDE's approvals?
Well, we are meeting internally next week to discuss alternatives. Following that, we'll be meeting with MDE, and then we'll be awaiting their response as we move forward.
Any other surprises you anticipate in that process?
Not that I don't anticipate anything additional, but I mean,
Better to give us the bad news early.
Yeah, the proposed CIP assumes sort of a steady state with that project, so the 15 to 20% he mentioned would be on top of what's in the proposed CIP.
Yeah, that's a big,
Yeah, so that's,
significant increase.
yeah, so that's something that will have to be accommodated, either increasing the CIP or finding other reductions elsewhere.
Keith, you said we could get into the county executive's recommendation of 5%. Was there a lot more you wanted to add?
Well, the only thing I would add there is that each 1% on the rate, this is about 6.2 million in revenue.
Right.
So dropping from the 6 to the 5 increases the unspecified reductions, if you will, that WCC would need to find based on all these assumptions by 6.2 million.
Right.
They already assumed about 4.6 in their base case, so it goes up to about 10.8 or 10.8 million, I think was the total gap, if you will, at 5%. So, and that matches the staff recommendation too, by the way. So the
Right.
scenario is the same.
Right. How, the county executive's appointee to the DC Water Board, who is that again?
We have two board members and
Right.
two alternates. It's the chief administrative officer and the DEP director are the primary board members, and then they have alternates that can serve and vote in their place if they can't attend.
And you point out that, so through that structure, we are allowed to push back on DC Waters.
Right, we have voting authority on joint use issues, not on DC-only issues. But yes,
Right.
on issues affecting the WSSC budget,
Right.
we do have representation on the board.
Like Blue Plains. How, does that ever happen?
Does-
Do we push back on any expenditures by DC Water?
Well, I think that happens in a couple of venues. Certainly, our board members work through the committee structure there to develop the DC Water budget and those issues. But then WSSC, which does not have representation on the DC Water Board, they work at the staff level with DC Water to understand what the numbers are and push back if they feel the numbers are not accurate or not consistent with the intermunicipal agreement. And, I mean, WSC can speak to their auditing of those numbers after the fact, but our board members will be involved before the fact to develop the DC Water budget and the joint use budget.
Right. Joe, how often does that happen?
For instance, last year, we did review their CIP. We identified about 10 projects that we thought could be reduced. We met with them, and they did make those reductions in their project as well.
How much
And
was
we
that
have-
worth?
Excuse me?
How much was that worth?
Can I get back to you on that? I can't recall. It was last January, February, we had that discussion. And also, we've sort of engaged them on sort of the ongoing operations and maintenance costs. They did add additional costs to that through the Potomac Interceptor, other sort of multi-jurisdiction use facilities, and we did engage them, challenge those on the assumptions, and so it did go ahead. So we are engaged with DC Water. We put them on notice that we're scrutinizing their budget and their charges to us. Also, every year, all the operations and maintenance costs are audited by our internal audit, and they regularly identify savings, and we get a reimbursement of varying amounts each year over, anywhere from $2 to $4 million.
Sorry, your own O&M costs or DC Waters?
DC Water, what they're
You audit,
charging us for.
your internal auditor audits DC Waters.
Yeah, what
O&M
they're
costs.
charging.
Their charges to WSSC.
Right, I understand, yeah. Okay, just wanted to clarify. Mr. Mantua, you and I talked about some reforms you were putting in place to increase the amount of competition for your contracts, probably a year or so ago. How's that going? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, yes, I would say that as we talked before about the issues that we've had with low bidding contracts, we've moved more to evaluated bids. We're moving away from low bids where it makes sense. We're moving towards progressive design build and other alternative delivery approaches. Those processes are in place. We are just now, it's probably too early to say whether we've seen, typically you want to get through the project because usually when you have low bid projects, the price comes in low, but then if you have a bad contractor, you're going to pay for it later.
Right.
We'll be seeing those benefits as we have these more qualified contractors working on the projects. We are not, I am not seeing the number of claims, the number of legal issues that we've experienced on past projects. So at this point, I would say that the process is working. We will continue to monitor that. But again, it's going to take time as these projects that we've just now initiated under a different approach, as they progress, we'll be able to tell you how that's working.
How common are design build contractors in your universe of contracts now that that's authorized?
There's an ample number of design. I mean, the larger the project, the universe shrinks.
Sure.
But there are certainly plenty of design contractors that are capable and willing to do the design build work. That's where our industry is moving anyway. So you're seeing more and more of that. And so I would say that there's plenty of capacity out there to handle design build. In fact, we're exploring looking into design build in the water main replacement side of things, which is something we haven't done before.
But there's been a lot of interest since the law was changed to allow.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
I think that's all I had. Thank you.
So did Ms. Florine accurately predict your vote, Mr. Hogger? Is this a 2-1 vote in favor of the county executives and staffs in Prince George's County's recommendations?
I appreciate all you're doing for the cost-saving measures you're putting in place. I encourage you to keep emphasizing redouble your efforts in that. I think the public is very sensitive to the significant increases that they've had to absorb, and with the new rate structure, I'm particularly sensitive to the lower income households that are going to be paying more under the new structure. So, but having said that, yeah, I think 5 is the best course of action.
Okay.
And one clarification, we do have council action on the consent calendar this Tuesday. Given it was 2-1, how does the committee feel about leaving that on consent or moving it to an action? You're okay with Tuesday? You can certainly speak to it on consent, or we could. All right, so we'll leave it on that for now, okay?
Only in the county's interest, Mr. Chairman. Only ever in the county's interest. I'll just give a little background as folks are coming up to the table. The county executive has sent over a draft memorandum of understanding, which has been,
Mr. Mayor?
come on down, been drafted between the city of Gaithersburg and the county executive, which would change the relationship in terms of how funds would be spent, county impact tax funds would be spent within the city of Gaithersburg. I have to give a little bit of history. I'll try to be real quick. The county council approved moving impact taxes to county-wide basis in 2002. Before that, it was only collected in 3 individual areas of the county. When it did so, the cities both objected to this, figuring that it interacted too strongly with their development approvals and what they'd like to see in the cities, and they didn't feel that the county had the authority, but it was clear the county did have authority to do this. And the county was trying to provide the same impact tax all across the county rather than try to have differential development costs in different areas. However, what was agreed to was that Gaithersburg and Rockville would both be treated differently than the rest of the county in that they would have their own districts, and that the money collected in Gaithersburg would stay in Gaithersburg, the money collected in Rockville would stay in Rockville, could only be spent on projects that the impact tax law allowed, which were projects that added capacity. But nevertheless, it would be sequestered that way, if that's a term. Also at the time, the decision was that money could be spent on anything that's consistent with the master plan and fit those categories of projects in each of the 2 cities, until there was an MOU that was signed between the city and the county that was approved by the council that specified projects, discrete projects on which impact taxes could be spent. So we went from a 4-year period from 2002 to 2006, where basically saying the master plan, if it's in the master plan, the county could spend the money on it. But in 2006, we finally did have MOUs, coincidentally, both with the city of Rockville and the city of Gaithersburg, which the city of Gaithersburg's resolution is on, actually included in your packet on circles 7 through 10. That was executed and lists projects, they're on circle 9, A through F, projects that we could spend impact tax money on. Bringing it up to a couple years ago, the council wanted to program funds to do the study for the Maryland 55 BRT project, $5 million study. And the idea was that part of the funding for that would come out of the impact taxes, county impact taxes collected in Rockville and the county impact taxes collected in Gaithersburg. And the agreement, which everyone seems to be abiding by, agree to, is that of the $5 million, $1 million should come out of the Rockville pot, $1 million should come out of the Gaithersburg pot, and $3 million should come out of the county pot, because roughly 20% of the right-of-way of the 355 BRTs in Rockville, 20% in Gaithersburg, 60% outside of those two cities.
Could I stop you there, Dr. Orland? When you talk about these pots, you are talking about county dollars
Yes.
that have been collected in Gaithersburg as a function of projects in Gaithersburg. Is that correct? These are county dollars?
Right,
Okay,
right.
thank you.
And so what Emma Lannon from DOT has been doing for the last couple of years is working with the city to try, each city, to try to get a revised MOU to include the accommodation of the $1 million that's been in the CIP actually for a couple of years. The last CIP version of it is also included in your packet on Circle 11 and 12, and you'll see the $2 million there on Circle 11, and the language on Circle 12 that it says assumes $2 million in impact taxes from the cities of Rockville and Gaithersburg towards 355 facility planning.
Is that because they weren't listed in the project-specific MOU previously that we needed to have this exercise?
Yes. Exactly. And the other reason for doing the update for the MOU is frankly, it's out of date. I mean, a lot of the projects are ones that are either done or the interest is past, and there are new things that the city would like to do, and I guess there's nothing in here more for the county, but and there's some restructuring of the resolution too to put the projects in one part of the resolution, which is Exhibit A. But the main reason, the main instigation for changing it was the $1 million for the BRT. So everyone acted in good faith in negotiating this new agreement, and it came to us a couple weeks ago. And again, I looked at it and I thought, well, just looking at it critically on Circle 6, which is the key page, what you see is parts A and B, which are basically two projects that are done. Not sure why they have to be in the resolution at all, but doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt to have them there. Doesn't hurt to keep them there, or not take them back. Can go either way. Just skipping to F, that's the $1 million we're talking about for the planning study that would come out of the. I'll just call it the Gaithersburg pot. But yes, these are county funds. And there's several conditions here. One is that Rockville also allow for the $1 million of county money to be spent on its portion of it, as well as other things such as the county puts up its $3 million. The county provides copies of invoices and appropriate documentation of how these impact taxes are used to the city, allowing city staff to participate in project management team meetings, and work with the city to identify the city residents or other businesses for appointment to the project's corridor advisory committee. Frankly, those last things would have been done anyway and are being done anyway, but the city felt important to actually put this in a legal document. And then C, D, and E are, instead of listing discrete projects, the idea was, well, let's list categories of projects because we don't know every individual bike lane or individual bike sharing station that might come up for funding, and so let's just keep it in these categories. The thing that struck my attention, frankly, though, was in C, D, and E, was the last phrase in each of them, which is that these projects could only be funded if they're in the Gaithersburg CIP. And there's nothing about projects that fit in these categories which are in the county CIP, of which there aren't any right now in terms of construction funding. There are a couple projects which are in facility planning, which could have actually used some of this money, but nothing in construction. And so I just come back to the idea that this is a county tax, and the council should control how the money's spent. It's not like the city of Gaithersburg can't ask for money. They've done in the past, City of Rockville has too, and you've been pretty generous with both in terms of funding projects that are their projects, if you will. And you proved just 2 days ago, Teacher's Way, which was in the old resolution. I think it was the right thing to do because it was part of the deal. It was a project they built 2.5 years ago. It's finished, and you've now reimbursed them for their cost for building that project. But at the very minimum, what I would say, and I frankly I would go further, but at the very minimum, I think we should ask that this resolution this MOU be returned to the city and to the county staffs to work out a new agreement which would have at least C, D, and E shown that it's either in the county CIP or the Gaithersburg CIP. Again, understanding the projects have to still be in Gaithersburg. It's not going to spend the money in Olney or North Potomac or something. And that the other thing is we wait for the Rockville resolution. And if the Rockville resolution has the $1 million, then we know we can actually tap the $1 million for the Gaithersburg. So that's my recommendation.
Emil, I'm sorry. I'm sure you do. Emil, you want to explain your rationale?
In terms of the rationale, we work with the city. I think, Glenn properly explained, this is a county tax. I think city staff feels otherwise. They feel that it's their money. Some of the provisions in the BRT section, yes, Gaithersburg wanted that. They wanted it to be contingent on Rockville's participation. I think it's a fair perspective from them. Why should Rockville get a free ride and they have to see money from their pot get contributed? We sent the MOU to Rockville back a year and a half or so ago. Rockville respectively declined to update the MOU. They have less money in that account, or there is less money in that account, I should say. They have a project that they would like to see all the remaining funds go towards, which is the extension of Maryland and Dawson Avenues in the town center area. So their perspective was, well, let's go ahead and let's see with Gaithersburg, what you decide with Gaithersburg, and then we'll revisit it. So once we had finalized the MOU with Gaithersburg, we have reached back out to Rockville. We have provided them an updated MOU. We met. I don't think we're going to see anything back from them before the end of the year. We were essentially told that. And again, the funds that are in that account, they want to prioritize towards that Maryland Dawson extension project.
So Emil, answer me a fundamental question.
Sure.
Because I believe at the heart of Dr. Orland's thinking. These are, with greatest respect to Mr. Ashman, the mayor, I think the county feels pretty strongly these are county dollars.
Yes.
Why should the county cede authority to Gaithersburg and Rockville as to how county dollars are spent?
Well, I think that's a
We
fundamental-
accept that it should be spent in Gaithersburg. We accept that it should be spent in Rockville. Why, as a county official, are we saying we have our priorities as county priorities in those two jurisdictions? We have things to do there. Why are we ceding authority for how those dollars are spent, county dollars, to a municipality whose priorities may not be the same as ours?
Mr. Berliner, I'm not sure I can answer your question. My charge was to go out and update the MOU with the sole purpose at that time was to try to get the BRT project in. The only way to get the BRT project in was to cede certain elements, as we did in item E. The other points that Glenn brings up is whether it's in the Gaithersburg or county CIP, that's probably correct. We should have tried to include that. That item is basically an update from the very items that were in the 2006 MOU. They were explicitly laid out in the Gaithersburg CIP. I was operating within the confines of what the existing law is now, which requires this MOU. And again, I think there is a different perspective on who really controls those funds. And I think that has been our challenge in this couple of year period, getting to the point that we got to.
So I think part of what I'm struggling with, and I'll turn it to you, Mr. Mayor, for your point of view, but then I'll turn it to my colleagues. What I'm struggling with is I'm hoping that BRT is a priority for the city of Gaithersburg.
It is.
So the notion that I perceive we're being leveraged to update an MOU that should have very clearly and easily allowed for the county dollars to be spent on the highest transportation priority the county has in BRT. And you guys saying, well, if you want to do that, I want control over how the dollars are spent. And I'm going, wait, these are county dollars. If you were in my shoes, would you be comfortable with ceding authority for county dollars to you to be spent as you wish, as opposed to how the county priorities in your jurisdiction, again, in your jurisdiction? So talk to me.
The structure, this whole mechanism, was forged in 2006. I actually wasn't even in office at that point. Maybe Sydney has some insight as to what the rationale was at that time. But
Turn to my colleagues after.
okay, fair enough. This is what we got. This is the system we got. And I have to tell you, from the city standpoint, we could have gotten this deal done in 30 days. We could have had some staff review, and I'm telling you now, this took.
You could have gotten done in a week, from your perspective.
This took one simple resolution of the council to agree to these terms. We've been negotiating for 2.5 years. And frankly, we've been open and inviting of county projects to be added to this list. What is it you guys want to add to this? We're totally flexible. But in terms of the mechanism itself, it is what it is. It's here, it's in place.
You object to having county projects in this?
No.
Do you object to Dr. Orland's recommendation that in addition to, as identified in Gaithersburg CIP and/or the county
I don't
CIP?
reject, we wouldn't reject that per se. The only element of Dr. Owen's recommendation we particularly don't like is that we should be able to agree. We should be able to come together and agree on what it is you want to put in this Exhibit A.
So if we had the same language as you have for Gaithersburg CIP, and we said and/or county CIP,
As long,
long as it's in the same categories, sidewalk, new road widening, new bus shelters, all the things that you said was okay for you, why shouldn't it be okay for us?
I'd have to go to my council and see if we have approval for that.
Okay. Thank you, sir. But
Yeah.
you can understand
I do.
my angst.
Yeah, and I'm sure you can understand mine.
I do. I think you guys did well under this agreement. Quite frankly, I don't think the county did. And I'm not okay with it, but I will allow all my colleagues to speak to it. I'll turn first, if you don't mind, if Ms. Florine, if you want to cede to the ex-mayor first.
I have a basic question. I
Okay.
appreciate being able to ask. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Glenn, and Jeb, maybe you can help with this. Glenn's memo says that we've collected 20 million plus in transportation impact taxes in Gaithersburg.
Correct.
But we've only spent 6 million?
Correct.
So we've been sitting on 14 million?
Well, correct, setting on 15.5 million before you.
Okay, 15.5 million. So, I mean, Mr. Ashman, I have to ask you, this is an issue of resources that have been collected on your behalf, whether it's our behalf, your behalf, and I'm on your side and the behalf side, if you're going to spend it. I mean, if you're not going to spend it, and I bless you, I appreciate the fact that Gaithersburg is fiscally conservative and has not one penny of debt. That's the way to be. There's very little value to Montgomery County of holding on to that money that's collected for transportation improvements to serve our collective residents. So I want to understand what we're collecting this money for, if it's to support Gaithersburg, if, we're not spending it. I mean, if we're not spending it, then we're not achieving the stated objective of the program. So can you explain why that's been? I mean, if you do not want transportation improvements in the city of Gaithersburg, I am more inclined to view the position of some that, well, okay, if you don't want it, fine. We've got projects to spend it on. And and apparently you haven't wanted it. So explain to me the situation from your perspective.
Sure.
And Mr. Katz, of course, can weigh in. And I know he's even more fiscally conservative than you, so there is that, at least on some things.
On some topics,
On a
yes,
few,
ma'am.
a couple of things.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe you could help me wander through the, as a former mayor myself, I appreciate your position, but, I mean, you should be spending this money on something.
Our perspective,
I mean, 15.5 million?
as I mentioned, our perspective has been, we've been inviting the county to come up with, give us suggestions for what they'd want. We actually have a couple that we think will probably be coming down the line that aren't on this list, that could be good suggestions for future amendments to this list.
So you have no current need for this money?
Oh, I wouldn't say that.
Well, if it's not on the list, and you've been negotiating for
we
2.5
started-
years, then it's not on the list.
We did start the negotiation a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And frankly,
It's time to put a list together.
we'll work on it. We'll add to the list. We will find the projects to suggest for this list.
I mean,
But
this is all
But
about,
that's the key is we're open to negotiation, we want to work with the county, and we have been. We've been open to it. We've been inviting amendments to this list. So,
but you don't have any yourself.
well,
We just need to tell you. I mean, I just find it odd that you want this agreement with Rockville to go forward. Presumably it will, whatever, but there is nothing, our residents who we all serve, who live in Gaithersburg, when these projects go in and these impact taxes are collected, they actually expect us to do something with it. And if we're not doing anything with it there, I mean, there's something to be said for you doing something with it elsewhere. You can see
I can see that. And I
that
think
sort
that
of thinking, kind of
perhaps-
complex, I suppose, but,
Yeah.
I-
Perhaps there's another term we can negotiate into this thing where if there's we can put a sunset on it. Whatever the case is, I just want our two jurisdictions to shake hands on this.
okay, thank you. Mr. Katz?
No, I'm sorry. It's not your prerogative. I'll turn to Mr. Hucker. Emil, do we not have any projects that, in this area of Gaithersburg, that we say to ourselves, we got work to do here?
Apparently, there are some projects listed in various master plans that can be added. I think Glenn had pointed out a few. And that's probably, again, my fault for, when I went into this thing, it was explicitly to update the project list and get the BRT in there, and that's what I focused on, was that BRT item. And that's where we really got hung up for the last 2 years in terms of negotiating those provisions of the BRT item. Again, from the city's perspective, probably those umbrella-type projects, the bike paths, the bus shelters, that was their main focus, and there was not other projects.
Basically gives them unlimited discretion in those broad categories, is to spend the money in any way that they so
Yeah,
desire.
we started out with this of trying to get kind of an open end on the BRT. The city objected to that, and we started developing gating strategies to at least deal with the LPA study for Maryland 355, to at least have that, and then come back and revisit the topic based on how much money was in the account when we got to that point in the next phase of the BRT, basically the design.
You can, sir.
There are projects that are coming down the line that will be to the benefit of everyone. For example, after Watkins Mill interchange opens, there's going to need to be some improvements at Clopper and Watkins Mill Road. As Lake Forest hopefully at some point redevelops, right now it's sort of back in a stalemate, but hopefully not for a long period of time. There could be some rethinking of where the county's transit center is. So we think that there are projects on the horizon that would be perfect fits for this.
And I'm sure there are. And I guess again, my fundamental objection should be, they should be county projects in your jurisdiction that serves your people very well. But they should be county priorities. That's this county official's perspective, and I feel like we gave up too much for something, quite frankly, that I resent we had to give up anything for, because BRT is too important to you and too important to Rockville, that we had to give away anything to extend this MOU for that purpose. Mr. Hucker? I can turn to,
Yeah, I'm eager to hear from Mr. Katz, but I'm still a little confused. So there's need, there's money collected, there's contractors available, there's projects you agree on or you don't agree on. Why isn't this more of this money on the street?
I don't know that that's a question that the city would answer. I think it's more.
Well, Emil, please,
Yeah.
I think there are.
fill me in.
We didn't focus on projects. Probably the city didn't identify other projects, specific, site-specific projects that they wanted listed, nor did I. Again, we went into this update to the MOU to try to get BRT in there. The main negotiations focused on the BRT. Everything else was really ancillary to that. There are probably projects that we can easily identify. Glenn has listed some. I think some things are perspective. What the mayor just talked about, Clopper, we're not going to list the state project in there because impact taxes can't be used on the state road, but the city or county leg of that intersection we can focus on. We can go back and identify projects that get listed in there. If they're perspective, what is the timeline for that money getting allocated to something? If we think something may come up in the future, the money still sits around until somebody conceives of a project and moves along with it.
Is it that hard to, I'm sorry, is it that hard to conceive of a project? Maybe it feels like I need to spend more time in Gaithersburg, but it sounds like a land where there's no traffic problems.
Let me fill in if I can. For county projects, unless they're really, really small, they usually go through facility planning first. There are a couple projects in the facility planning PDF which are funded, it's funded for facility planning, but not right now, like in a couple of years. It's within the 6-year period. One is intersection improvements at Great Seneca Highway and Muddy Branch Road. And similar to what Emma just finished saying about Clopper and Watkins Mill, Great Seneca Highway is a state highway, but Muddy Branch is a county road. And so to the extent that that improvement ends up being designed, we spend for the design and construction cost of the county portion of that with Gaithersburg impact taxes. They're within the city of Gaithersburg. You could even spend the money on the facility planning for that project, which is in the CIP now, again, but not in FY19. It's like a couple years down. Another project is...
But what's stopping that? I still don't understand.
The MOU. The MOU doesn't allow...
Nothing can go forward until the MOU is signed.
Well, no, the current MOU is proposed still wouldn't allow it because it's not in the city CIP.
Because it's not in their CIP.
Right.
Why aren't the people sitting in traffic in Gaithersburg all on their cell phones saying, please put it in the CIP and spend $14 million that you've already taxed me for?
And one of the things we can do is those projects that are in facility planning, they're scheduled for the out years based on the availability of funds. They can be
They could have been
advanced.
accelerated.
They can be advanced, accelerated if the money was available.
Yeah, the other project...
Money is available.
The other project that's in the facility planning now, which fits in the same category, is the park and ride lot at the Metropolitan Grove Mark Station, which is, again, a legitimate impact tax expenditure. Expanding park and ride lots is legitimate, and that would be a county effort as well. Again, the facility, just that, I'll just finish saying, the facility planning money for that is in the outer years, and yeah, it could be accelerated to sooner if just money, even if nothing else, just paying for the facility planning costs for those. Now, both of those together, I don't have the dollars in front of me, but it's probably a few $100,000 each. That's pretty small. I think what the city was very worried about, and I can certainly understand it, is if we do say all of BRT in Gaithersburg paid for out of impact taxes, because that would just swallow up all the money. Or all of this Quarter Cities Transitway in Gaithersburg, that would swallow up all the money. But, if, for example, the CCT gets restarted somehow in the next, year or so, and can you actually, there's an agreement as to what to build, and there's some design work that could be done on the CCT. Yeah, you could use impact tax money to help design a portion of that. It's a busway, it's something, that's a legitimate BRT cost. Again, trying to honor the arrangement we have with the 355, which is you don't pay for things outside of Gaithersburg on the CCT, just the portion of it that's within Gaithersburg. Same for Rockville, by the way, through the King Farm. So there are all kinds of opportunities for using county money on county projects, and the state's made it pretty darn clear that BRT is a county project, and the CCT is going to be a county project. They're not going to contribute. Well, the state's got sort of a tangent. The state has some money in the beyond 6 years for the CCT, but it's still they consider it a county project. In fact, that's one of the things they put on their PDF for tonight, the roadshow. They're saying that it's going to be turned over to the county. So anyway, there are things that can be done.
Do you want to,
Let's hear from Steve.
the mayor has been waiting?
I don't want to get in your way, but just one follow-up about the city's capital improvements program process. Is there a way, I assume you do it like we do, an annual part of the budget? You're probably annual as opposed to us, which is every other year. But we
Annual.
amend it all the time,
Annual,
so.
yeah.
Annual. But, and you could, like, make mid-year adjustments as well, presumably.
Yes.
If you chose to.
Sure.
So there is a way of proceeding cooperatively.
Yes.
On these things. Thank you.
Mr. Former Mayor, and now county official.
Thank you. I changed uniforms on this deal, and I can tell you part
Which
of
side
the.
of the ball you're on?
Yeah, that's right. And part of the problem that we have is that in 2006, we had great negotiators in Gaithersburg. I happened to be there, and I mean, and it's very tough to update a great negotiated deal. Having said that, I certainly understand that this money is not the city of Gaithersburg's money, and I think we should be very clear on that. This is Montgomery County's impact tax money that back in 2006, the powers that were the elected officials and the appointed officials that were there said, look, it's come through. We believe that the impact should be paid. It should be if you're paying an impact tax, that it should be in the area where the impact is going to be done, and this was through the city's planning authority. Having said all that, we came up with a list. We came up with a list that said these projects should be spent. And I think everybody was in agreement. It's taken, this is since 2006. Just as an example, for Teachers Way, I think it was done a year and a half ago or so. And just this Tuesday, the Montgomery County said, okay, we're going to pay you back your $1.5 million, City of Gaithersburg. And so it was to the benefit of not just city residents. But it certainly was to the benefit of city residents and beyond, I guess is the way to say it. The biggest, do you want to, I mean, are we okay? Okay. Not a problem. The biggest problem with this whole thing is, and if you look on the second paragraph of Glenn's memo, it says for the past few years, the DOT has been working with the city of Gaithersburg to try to come up with a different agreement for this MOU, and the county has reached agreement with the city of Gaithersburg to update its MOU, and the executive recommends that the council approve it. The city of Gaithersburg or the city of Rockville or whoever, if they in good faith worked with the county, and I understand we believe the county is in different pockets, different areas, I don't want to say pockets, but different areas. They worked with the county executive and
Subject to our.
I understand that, but to the city of Gaithersburg, they reached an agreement. And for 40 hours before this agreement comes to this committee, Glenn said, look, we got problems. Well, they made agreements based on what they believed that they were making a fair assessment. And then at the last minute to say, yeah, you checked with your father, but you got to now check with your mother and see if we can start this process over. That is, to me, is a real gripe. And the process shouldn't be that way so that somebody believes that they're making a deal and that they really didn't. That's number one. Number two, I sincerely believe that there should be a statement in here that says that it should be either in the CIP for the city of Gaithersburg or should be in the CIP for Montgomery County, but that both bodies have to agree on how that money would be spent, and to have a safety valve that said if it isn't spent after X number of years, it took a year and a half for the county to pay the city back. So whatever it takes, whether it's after 6 years, after 5, whatever the right number is, then to say that the county has a right to use the money in the way that they would feel is the most appropriate. I think it is to the benefit of all involved if there could be a better communication to what we have today. This has been for 12 years. And for the 11th hour, for this to come back this way, to me, is very distasteful. However, I do believe that if we don't do this today, then you're going to have to go back and the city of Gaithersburg already passed this resolution. The county executive has certainly recommended it and would sign it, and that means this whole process would start over again. And I don't know that we're gaining anything to hold up the BRT process. I believe that the BRT process, which started this whole thing, said from the city of Gaithersburg side, or from Rockville, or from anybody else, or from Montgomery County, to say that we're going to do 20% of the study and not look at 80% of the study would be ridiculous. And that's what we're saying if we only used it from the city of Gaithersburg's perspective, their 20%, if we only used it from the city of Rockville's perspective, or from Montgomery County. There should be a meeting of the minds. This would take it for the BRT. We should go back, figure out the rest of this thing, and get it done.
So the chair would make the following observation, and thank you, and you are too good a negotiator, because I would say to you, if I were czar of the universe, we would amend section 52-41E and say, I'm sorry, we will spend the money in your jurisdiction, but it's our money, period. End of conversation. I don't need to have your approval as to how I'm going to spend my money in your jurisdiction. But that's, if it's in our CIP, and they can participate in our CIP process. In fact, I believe you have participated in our CIP process. So that's just one person's point of view. So I think you negotiated in good faith. I think, Emil, you negotiated within, as you said, certain self-described limitations on how you went about your business. I don't think this is a good deal. I don't think this is a deal that we ought to move forward with at this moment in time. I agree that it ought to be amended, and I think we ought to have conversation as to how to amend it. I resist the notion, I think we got into this trouble by identifying particular projects, because then they are out of date unless we have a sunset clause with respect to it. But, so I understand some flexibility might be necessary if there are projects like in our CIP that are at the facility planning stage. Goodness gracious, why aren't we accelerating those with the dollars we have? To have $15 million in dollars and not be using them in these jurisdictions where, as was observed by Mr. Hucker or somebody, I believe there's traffic problems there. That we've got work to do together that ought to be something that we can work through. So I'm just saying, I'm not for this deal. I am for a deal, a fair deal, one that we all look at and go, this is respectful of both of us. Mr. Hucker, I didn't know if you were raising your hand.
I haven't raised my hand.
Okay, apologize, go ahead.
Well, I completely disagree with you about what you said about not respecting the local priorities of the municipalities. But I think we've moved beyond that. And I think that I hear agreement from Mr. Katz and Mr. Ashman that there is some clarification that we could offer here with respect to items both in the county CIP and in yours. And the concept that what would be proposed in one CIP, would it be accepted by the municipality, or appropriate language to that effect? You were shaking your head, isn't that right?
Correct.
So is that something that you believe that the Gaithersburg Council would be supportive of once they had that conversation?
That we could amend it in the way
Yeah,
that
to
Sydney
reflect that.
suggested, where if it's in either CIP, as long as the two parties agree.
Concurrence. So could we ask you to take, I would propose that you take it back to the Gaithersburg City Council, not start the whole thing all over again, but take it back and see if we could come to some agreement on the words that would achieve that end. Because I think that's what everybody up here is, at least some of us are saying. We want your concurrence. We don't want any hold up, of course. What the county's done in good faith is to focus on BRT. There may be other solutions, and we really do want to use this money to the benefit of everybody. It sounds like there's a list in place already that might be productive. I don't know if you have to have it written down or not, but I think the concept of concurrence is the part that's missing. And if we could introduce that into this agreement, I think we could move on. So that would be my recommendation to the committee.
Positive recommendation, Mr. Hyde.
I agree. I thought you said you disagreed. How long is this MOU in place? I don't see any expiration date. I know that. But, I know. So say we sign it today. We walk out of here, kumbaya, everybody signs it. How long is it? There's no expiration. It doesn't sunset, doesn't get revisited, correct?
It's in effect until it's changed. Now, what this resolution says is that Exhibit A, which are the projects, the city can request that, and actually, really, the county should be able to too, every 6 months could come back and say, we'd like to change this project, rather than changing the whole rest of the body of the MOU, but it would still require agreement between the city and the county, and still require council approval. But the short answer is, it's in effect until it's changed.
Right, so there's no sunset written in here, expiration. It's for practical purposes, it's when the projects are completed.
Or if the project.
And then there's a new exhibit added.
If there are dead projects in there, they want to clear out, and the new ones they want to add.
Sure.
Right.
Okay, I think Ms. Florine articulated some of my thoughts. I'm sympathetic with the city and the former mayor and his crack negotiating team on the process. And I wouldn't have wanted to be in this position either, and I don't want to be in the position we're in, because to me, this feels, Mr. Katz said it was like negotiating with dad and then having to go back and negotiate with mom. That's how the collective bargaining process feels here to me, where the executive, correct, the executive branch, which has no authority to spend the money, gets to do all the negotiating, and then comes over here, and we are the bad guys and girls that have to actually fund it. So I feel like we should have had some role in this all along. And
This is the life of the council.
Not that you were invited.
The council lives in the 11th hour. We might as well start our meetings at 11 p.m. at night and everything, because all these processes, almost everything goes through many, many months or years, in fact. It's brought to the council, and you're basically told to approve this.
Well,
And so, there's no alternative to actually,
I disagree, there's no alternative.
well, no alternative
I doubt it's done this
on
way
most
everywhere.
things, to be able to actually have a real negotiation. In fact, it's pretty clear that the executive branch is supposed to be the one that negotiates these kinds of things, and it's brought to the council to see if they consent. So I'm just saying, it's all kinds of issues.
I understand. I think there's a role for us to play to avoid these sort of last-minute conflicts. I agree this could be, I am sympathetic to the position you're in. I thought we were talking about a smaller amount of money, but I'm kind of shocked there's $14 million in this alternate universe called Gaithersburg, where there is no traffic and there's no projects, to spend them on. And if I can guarantee you, if there were $14 million available in Silver Spring, people would have all kinds of ideas for what we could do to provide traffic relief there. So one day maybe I'll want to live in Gaithersburg. I agree.
My son lives in.
I agree. We could improve this, and it sounds like we're going to have a process to do that. So.
Mr. Katz.
Yeah, thank you. I think, first off, when this comes back, that there should be an agreement before the 11th hour. I understand you're saying that we do this all the time. We shouldn't do this all the time. This is not the right way to treat people who are negotiating in good faith, quite candidly. Or for us, I'm saying people who are negotiating. Secondly, I do think it should be noted in the municipalities, and we're saying that there's no traffic problems. Of course there's traffic problems. There's huge traffic problems. But the cities themselves also have their own money that they use towards some sidewalks and some traffic issues and other things. So it's not like just in Silver Spring where it's all county funding. They would have to the point. I mean, and the other thing is, and I think that this is an extremely something to keep in mind, that this 2006 agreement is still going to be in effect until we can change this agreement. Now, there again, you have a much greater negotiator on this side of the team than you used. I'm kidding, but the bottom line on this is that we should be doing this as quickly as we can, work with our partners, in this case it's the city of Gaithersburg, but work with our partners in the city of Rockville as well to get this thing accomplished and to accomplish it as quickly as we can. The study for BRT needs to go forward as quickly as possible.
Mr. Mayor, you may. And you always do it in a very positive spirit. I've always appreciated how you've gone about your business, sir.
Thank you, Councilmember. Just to address Councilmember Hucker's statement, of course, we have traffic challenges in the city of Gaithersburg, but I would like to just point out that this fund can only go to certain types of projects. It can't. It has to add capacity, and so I think the way we've conceived of this fund is for some really big stuff. And when those opportunities come, for example, as you mentioned at Muddy Branch and Great Seneca, or with the interchange, or with potentially any potential big thing with the transit center, those are and obviously with BRT, those are big things. So
We got big things to do.
we haven't been negligent about this fund. We've tried to be strategic about it.
We thank you, and we think you negotiated in good faith, and we've got more work to do, and we should get to work on it. So I think the committee's recommendation is that we would not move forward at this time and see if we can't come up with something a little more even-handed.
Well, and can I suggest, I just think we need a more consultative process where maybe it's Dr. Orland that consults with us, finds out what position we're looking for, participates in the negotiations, and comes back with something that the committee feels more comfortable with.
Thank you. We're done with this item.
Okay, the next item is the facility planning review of Summit Avenue, while the county folks are coming up.
One more, two more.
For a very long time, projects that are in facility planning, oh, I'm sorry. We need that, right. Projects that are in facility planning go through two phases. The phase one is looking at several different alternatives. And then phase two, they look at one alternative, maybe two, in much more detail. And typically happens at this point, since phase one is done, is the planning board first takes a crack at looking at what DOT's come up with. They make recommendations. And then it comes to the T&E committee, and the T&E committee then gives, it's really guidance, it's not a direction. It's guidance to DOT as to which alternative to carry forward into phase two. Then phase two is going to take another couple years, a year and a half, 2 years. And at that point, the executive may or may not recommend that project for full funding in the CIP for final design, land acquisition and construction. And there's 2 points to this. One is that you can have this check-in early so that they don't come back with a project at the very end that you say, what the heck's this? You know, we don't want this. And then we wasted a lot of money, a lot of time. And the other reason, frankly, is so that they're not looking at lots of alternatives in phase two, because a lot of detailed work does go forward and say phase two, it reduces the cost of the second phase. So Summit Avenue has been in the CIP for facility planning for a couple of years. Phase one is finished. And John Thomas is here to give you a quick overview of what the alternatives are. Steve Aldrich with the planning board staff is going to talk a little about what the planning board's recommendations are. I'll make a couple comments and then ask you to make your recommendations to DOT as to what to carry forward in phase two.
Is it my understanding, just to help set that DOT planning and council staff are all of one mind with respect to this?
Yeah, pretty much. There are some little details, but I think we should go through this. I mean,
Along with the city of Kensington.
pardon me?
Along with the
The
town?
town of Kensington, too.
So, thanks, Dr. Rowland. Thank you, council members. I'm John Thomas, I go by JT. I'm the planning manager for DOT Engineering. In fact, we do have council staff here, both Sanford Daly and Matt Hoffman. No, council member.
Yeah, Councilman Crimmins.
Crimmins. Councilmember Crimmins from the town, so if you want to get feedback from them, we can do that as well. So, as Dr. Rowland said, this is the phase 1 of facility planning. This project started with the 2012 Kensington Town Master Plan as a line on the map. And then DOT is tasked with coming up with what our options are for implementing that line on the map. So generally from north to south at the intersection of Connecticut Avenue, which is a State Highway Maryland 185, and University Boulevard, State Highway Maryland 193, from the north at Farragut Ave, south and west down, intersecting back with Pliers Mill Road where the Summit Avenue crosses the railroad tracks. That's the general scope of this line on the map that we're talking about today. So I mentioned where that came from. We're in the middle of facility planning. Generally, facility planning, we do our alternatives analysis, we do our public outreach, we do our as far as the environmental analysis goes, we do that. And we start to get prepared for an alternative that we can take forward into phase 2 and get a better view of the costs themselves. So this project itself is not funded for final design, right away, or construction. I try to make that clear every time we talk about that. It's just funded for that first piece of facility planning. We did have a good bit of public outreach, and we'll continue to have more in phase 2. We had 2 public meetings in 2017, and we've had public meetings with the town of Kensington as well to talk about this. Just mouse upside down here. There we go. We're going to call long-term improvement 1 the master plan alignment. So again, that's from north to south, a master plan roadway, and I'm going to show you the little cross section as well. 2 typical sections. I'm going to jump from typical section option A to typical section option B, which is consistent with the master plan. That's 2 11-foot travel lanes, a 6-foot sidewalk on one side, a 2-way separated bike lane, and a sidewalk on the other side. So that's the roadway that we're talking about. It's a little bit less than a quarter mile.
Path, isn't it? That's a bike path, isn't it?
The master plan is a separated bike lane.
Separate, oh, I see what you're saying, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so a buffer between the travel lane and the bikeway on one side. Traffic. Part of all of our facility planning analysis is traffic. Historically, all of you know, and everybody in the room knows, that congestion on Maryland 185 and University has been an issue for many, many years. So one of the benefits, and this started with the master plan, and all along, both our traffic folks and State Highways traffic folks have said, okay, what is the benefit of building this connection? So in general, that's what we do with our traffic study. So you see, you still see a lot of Fs on there. That being said, when we dig in no build versus build in 2040, there are some benefits to building this extension. The quickest way to delve into that, rather than talking to you about all these colors and letters, is things get a little bit better, but I'm going to jump even further and say, all right, what happens to Connecticut Avenue? Because that, again, that was the genesis of this project in the master plan. Can we get Connecticut Avenue and those intersections to improve to get the master plan compliant with the traffic requirements set forth? So generally, if we build that connection from University and Connecticut over down to Pliers Mill, you take about 10% of the peak period traffic off of Connecticut, and generally southbound. That's the highlight. Now, are there other benefits at other intersections? Sure. Are there downstream impacts to sending more people that way? Sure. But generally, the biggest message that I like to share is we're taking about 10% of that peak period traffic off of Connecticut and moving it on to the extension itself. So what would it take, and that's part of our process as well, what would it take to do that? It takes some property impacts. So in brief, there's a lot of existing land use through there. So there's commercial buildings, a total of 7, that would have potentially full displacement as part of taking that master plan alignment through. Now, when we get into final design with respect to these projects, we do absolutely go through a minimization and mitigation to see if those 7 full displacements at the early concept level can be reduced. Could it be 7? Could it be 6? Could it be 5 or less? We haven't gotten to that level of detail, so I really look at this as kind of the worst case scenario. But that being said, they're at the conceptual design level that we're at now. There's potentially 7 displacements. Originally, we looked at those as 7 commercial developments. Actually, in fact, one of those 7 is the town garage that the town of Kensington owns and operates right here. Also, these commercial buildings down here are actually mixed-use buildings. So there's actually apartments in these buildings as well. So I wanted to be clear the types of real estate impacts. So not only the commercial buildings, but also the town garage, and they have some thoughts on that, but also there's some mixed-use apartments above the commercial developments. And that really drives the next part of the facility planning process is the cost. So if we look at potential costs of, again, long-term 1, which is the master planned alignment, a big portion of a range in cost from 18 to 20 million, a big portion of that is right-of-way. So again, these are conceptual estimates at this point, but 75% of those costs are right-of-way costs. The roadway itself range from 4 to 7 million, but again, with the right-of-way costs. So tying that back to the traffic benefit, there is traffic benefit, there are costs, there are right-of-way impacts. So that's generally at facility planning phase 1, that's the message that we want to bring to you all with that specific alignment before we go into phase 2. So before I jump into phase 2, what we didn't want to do is just stop with just one alignment and say, all right, you know what, we're done. This is $18 to $20 million of cost and 7 property impacts. What should we do next? We also wanted to say, okay, are there some other alternatives that have some benefit to the town of Kensington, that have some benefit to congestion along Maryland 185 and Maryland 193 and Pliers Mill and Summit and Concord and Metropolitan, et cetera. What else can we do? So there's a couple other alternatives that later in the process, once we saw those initial impacts, we wanted to bring to you and show as potential alternatives. One of which is not taking the extension as far up, so just going about halfway up to what the existing roadway DuPont. If you remember, about half of the property impacts are still there, but what this does is cut that property, or the total cost, in half, or less than half, down to about 7 million with this extension. The downside with that is bringing that out at this spot is in the middle of the northbound left turn lanes on Connecticut. It's also an additional signal in the middle of a very busy spot, where a busy signal here, a busy signal here at Pliers Mill, and also a emergency preemption signal at the firehouse. So when we talk to State Highway about this concept, they're a little bit reluctant to make that work. But it is something that, from a community perspective, and I think from some staff's perspective, adds another east-west crossing for people walking and bicycling, and that's something that we did hear a lot. But certainly would have some challenges with implementation. Long-term improvement 3 would be widening the main line Connecticut itself. That is kind of driven a little bit by the life of this bridge over the CSX rail, which is not ready to be replaced right now. Also would have some minor right-of-way impacts. With all of those long-term costs, we also wanted to bring to you, hey, we've got the resources now. What other things can we do out there to help with the existing conditions in the shorter term? So we've got a menu of items that could be one standalone items, or they could be bundles and packages of items at a much lower cost, $300,000 to $2 million, that could be done, and the extension still could be done later as well. So these are things that our team has identified and also reviewed with the town of Kensington. that we have to work with. And they're basically, long story short, they're turn lane improvements, intersection improvements, et cetera. In fact, one of the consolidation of a bus stop improvement is already in the process, a simple thing that we can do today to reduce the numbers of times that the buses are stopping and queuing up traffic behind them. So we've heard a lot of comments from the public, both residents in the town of Kensington and those folks and community and neighbors in the town of Kensington. All of this we want to do and try to maintain a community character. So having a roadway design, if it's at the master plan extension, a roadway design that's context sensitive. We heard from the neighbors in the Kengar community to the west that, you know what, this roadway is really in our backyard. And then we wanted to be sensitive to that as well. So that's something that we heard a lot. We heard a lot of folks that say, I just can't get across Connecticut Avenue. So that concept of improving the conditions for people walking and biking across Connecticut Avenue to get to the businesses on the east side from the residential areas on the west side, we did hear a lot. And we heard some other things as well, that certainly all of the above we can reflect as we move into phase 2. And we heard from both the town and the planning board, and both the town and the planning board are, at least staff-wise and council are here today and they can weigh in on this, but generally they both support the extension as planned, that L1, that long-term alternative. They both also support the short-term improvements, but not in the context of one or the other. They support both. And there's a couple other things that Stephen and his staff added that are very easy for us to incorporate into phase 2. So with that, I'll stop and let you ask questions and hear from the town and or planning board staff.
Planning board staff, do you have any additional observations to make that would assist us?
Yes, this is Steve Aldridge from the Planning Department. JT's presentation, definitely very consistent between Glenn's memo, their presentation. We're I would say like 99% consistent. The one thing I'd like to add is that in the Planning Board's recommendation, they did strongly favor alternative L1, but what they did say is alternative L2 is worthy of consideration in the event that alternative 1 cannot be pursued. So we didn't want to discard it, but we see it as the second choice.
Got it. Does the town care to make any observations? If you feel like your view has been presented accurately?
Sanford Daly, Town Manager.
Nice to see you, sir.
Connor Crimmins, Town Council Member.
Anything you care to add? Are you comfortable with the presentation that's been made?
We're pretty much together on this in terms of how it deals with the town. We know it's more expensive, and we appreciate all of the efforts to try to deal with it. I've been town manager for 10 years, and this canyon between the east side of town and the west side has been a problem for years and years. Somewhere around 55 to 58,000 cars a day travel that 2-block section between Knowles and Pliers Mill. This is the only solution that we see to the problem. All of the suggestions are improvements, but without the improvement of going across the railroad bridge, Knowles Avenue doesn't get any help. It's the only way to get help with Knowles, and that is a terrible, terrible situation with 3-way traffic coming east and 1 lane going west. And we support going further with the study, looking at all this stuff. We've even suggested that maybe Concord be used to get traffic from Metropolitan through and up to points north in a way that minimizes the bottleneck at the fire station trying to make a left turn to go to Pliers Mill and to Metropolitan. And we think strongly that you should go forward and keep it in the project and study the heck out of it, look at all these things, and make sure we end up making a good decision.
I confess that whenever Google Maps gets me onto Connecticut and University and then has me take a left onto Pliers Mill, I go, no, don't make me do this. You'll be sitting there forever. It is just the worst. Dr. Orland, do you have anything to add to this at this juncture?
Just a couple things. Could you bring the map back up with showing either L1 or L2, doesn't matter, but something with the aerial photo there? Doesn't, well, not that well. That's good. Well, that's good. That one's good. Yeah, I did want to point out the Concord part of this. The master plan.
Would you go up there? Oh, you got it. Okay.
That's what we're talking about. Concord Street does come down, south is to your left, actually, and north is to your right. It comes right down to the intersection of Pliers Mill Road and Metropolitan Avenue. And the idea is if you could make a left turn off of Connecticut onto Concord, then you'll have almost no, or maybe even no, left turns on southbound Connecticut to eastbound Pliers Mill, which would improve things incredibly. And the interaction of these alternatives are kind of interesting. And I'm glad Steve brought this up. L2, if it were built, would cause a median break at Connecticut Avenue. And if you were able to provide a left turn bay there over to Concord, then the shortening of the left turn bay to Pliers Mill wouldn't be an issue anymore because it'd be turning the traffic there. So this all needs to be looked at more closely in phase 2, I think. I think everyone's in agreement on that. One other thing I mentioned before I give my recommendation, which is just on the top of page 3, shows for different combinations, different routes. Depending on the route you're taking, the travel time savings differ. But in any event, L1 does provide substantial travel time savings in 2040 compared to the no build. Compared to today, generally speaking, it makes it no worse than it is today. In other words, the growth in traffic that will happen even further over the next 22 years will be mitigated by all these improvements. And maybe to a little bit of degree, even a little bit better, but it's not going to make things wide open. Okay. Now, if the project's built in 2025, then yeah, it'll be a lot better. But by 2024 will be back to more or less where it is today. My recommendation is the same as the other folks, is to carry L1 into phase 2 of facility planning. Make sure we're looking at Concord Street as part of the solution. That may end up being that because of the cost and the impacts and the fact that you'd have maybe even a 5-legged intersection if you did L1 and Concord, that maybe L2 with the Concord connection there might make sense as well, or instead of. And that the short-term alternatives really ought to be done as soon as possible, because they will provide real relief, not substantial relief, but measurable relief in the next 2 to 5 years, depending on how quickly they can be done. And the one thing I'd say, this is sort of a little premature to this discussion, because this discussion is just like what should they study in phase 2. They should finish phase 2 so they'll know precisely where L1 or L2 will go. So a developer developing that quadrant could say, okay, here's where we need to put the road. But it might be in the interest of the county at that time to be determined to wait on building L1 or L2 until that redevelopment happens because of this right-of-way impact. If in fact the area does redevelop, the developer will be dedicating right-of-way anyway, will be taking over these buildings, tearing them down, and this project, instead of being a $19, $20 million project, could be a $5 to $6 million project. And the key again is how long will the short-term improvements make do, and then how long will it be before the redevelopment happens. If the redevelopment doesn't happen for 15, 20 years, then the county may make the decision, now let's just go ahead and do it, spend the money and do it. But it really depends on the timing of when that area redevelops. So that's my recommendation.
Ms. Florine, this is your hood, or right next to your hood.
No, it's my hood, all right. I wanted to know what the town thought about the short-term improvements.
Thank you, Connor Crimmins, Town Council Member. All of the short-term improvements we welcome.
You're good with? Okay.
Yeah, they're great. We understand and we see the benefit of them, but to the doctor's point, they don't give substantial relief. That's what the L1 is for. We welcome all of the short-term improvements.
Well, yeah, you know, the big issue is Summit, really, all that traffic, and then all the, I mean, I know when I know at the end of my street, when there's something going on. I guess there've been multiple fire incidents, so they have to stop all the traffic at the firehouse, but when the backup can be as far as the other side of Beach Drive, when things are bad up at that intersection.
Yes, ma'am.
And I will just make another point, what people go way out of their way to avoid that intersection, which also places a burden on the northern part, I don't know, the Delafield Avenue and the like, farther north, where people will drive through a residential neighborhood to get to Beach Drive to avoid this intersection. So anything that can be done that makes sense to eliminate the pressure points at Knowles and Connecticut, I think would be a very, very good thing. I assume that this project would include some improvements between the bridge and Knowles. Right now, it's, as you know, a collection of like auto body shops and stuff like that, all of which we need, of course, but that portion of the roadway needs some attention as well, and I assume that's part of your thinking going forward. It's not part of the, because you're talking about everything north of the bridge. Oh, clean up, oh, there it is. Yeah, clean up Summit Avenue, that's what you need to do. Yeah, well, and we got to do this.
Could I add 30 seconds more? There's an issue that came up in the last 24 hours. Delegate Carr and I talked. He's concerned about perhaps the impact of this road on Kengar, because L1 and L2 to a certain degree backs up to houses that are in Kengar. In Phase 2, one of the things the DOT will be doing is, again, deciding precisely where the road goes. And I would assume part of this would be to figure out what the buffer would be between the west end of L1 or L2 and the fences, the backyards, whether it's
I would
trees
suspect
or
it's pretty hard for
fences.
the folks there to get home, given the existing backups there, coming up from Summit and
Exiting
across.
from the Kengar community, ma'am, and trying to go
Yeah.
eastbound on Pliers Mill.
They're
Even
stuck.
where there is not a stop, they have
Right.
the right of way, they cannot proceed.
They can't because of all the through traffic, so I
Routed
think
over
this
the
would,
ma- It's backed up for
yeah, so
miles.
this would really help them in that respect. I can understand the community concern about the through traffic part of it, and, but nonetheless, we really need, and you're only talking about 2 lanes.
Yes, ma'am.
So you're not talking about a major facility, and that would be consistent with what is occurring below the bridge.
And not to make light of the previous conversation in the city of Gaithersburg, but this is our problem. Every town meeting,
Yeah,
it comes back to traffic. Our development that is now starting to come under the sector plan is everything comes back to traffic, and it is between Summit Avenue and Connecticut. It is that stretch of Knowles and then up to Pliers Mill. And it is, without L1, it really puts the town's future in peril.
absolutely,
You
absolutely.
have the perfect person at the table who can talk about both the city of Gaithersburg and the city of town of Kensington.
Yeah,
Mr.
indeed.
Daley, who was the town manager for how many years?
Almost 27.
27 years.
He was the one who negotiated that.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't.
He was smiling during the course of the conversation. Mr. Hucker, anything to add?
Sure. Well, I was going to ask our local experts on this question of when do you think it'll redevelop it? What's your prediction?
So redevelopment is already beginning. There is actually a project that planning just approved 2 hours ago for an apartment complex located right mid-block on Knowles Avenue. And this is a wonderful project because it is going to be almost entirely MPDUs, which the county desperately needs.
How many units?
93 total units. And originally was proposed to be slightly higher, about 121 units. But because of the traffic concerns, it was problematic for our development review board. It was problematic for our council. The developer was willing to downscope the project in order to help alleviate some of the traffic concerns.
Okay.
So, but there are 3 other projects in the works all along the Connecticut corridor that will contribute, to traffic in some regards, but more than just us. There are projects in Wheaton upstream, there are projects in Chevy Chase Lake downstream that are all going to contribute to traffic along this corridor.
Since you're here, anything you can share about those 3 projects?
You're not going to drive.
So there's a main, right at the intersection, unfortunately, that Councilmember Berliner just identified, there is a potential, there's a lot that is a former gas station that there is talk to do development on. The initial project is not maybe the most desirable project.
Want to keep all your gas stations?
It's
Well,
a gas station.
it was either that or self-storage. Those seem to be the
Be
things.
self-storage.
But just down Metropolitan at St. Paul, so if you make that unfortunate left turn on Pliers Mill, that is my house. So I do it every day, twice a day. But at Metropolitan in St. Paul, right at the Mark Station, is another senior living complex, which will be independent, dependent, and memory care. And that project, the town is highly, highly supportive of and is hopeful that it will break ground in January. And that is another one that is, it is 200 some odd units, low traffic impact, but a wonderful addition to the community. But again, without some traffic relief, it's going to cause issues.
Sure. JT, would you mind going back to figure 4, I think it is?
Which,
Well, there you go. The other one might be more helpful, but just the intersection of Summit Avenue Extended and Connecticut and
sorry, it's very sensitive.
Pierce Mill. We're all very sensitive around here. Yeah, well, that's fine. On the right side, the intersection there, maybe you talked about this, but how do you signalize that? And it looks very,
Well,
no, the other one.
The other one.
With the stripes. It looks awful,
No, keep going.
the intersection that
They do it now. That's how they do it.
No, Nancy, hold on.
Oh, that's all right.
if you move that signal there, you then have a movement possibility of Connecticut down this way and a left turn movement this way from University. You have the possibility of the vehicles being able to come up here, stop, and then proceed through this direction or straight through.
That would be,
And if I'm coming up Summit there where it's extended, I can make the left onto Connecticut, but I'm not,
Well, that's part of the study. You
Okay.
have to figure out how to deal with that signalization and that problem. I mean, a nice big circle would be fine, but then you take all the businesses.
I was going to ask about that, yeah.
And to Mr. Daly's point as well, the advantage of Concord Avenue in the mix is that it can help to relieve some of the traffic congestion at Pliers Mill and Metropolitan, which in the afternoon can back up all the way, over a mile and a half. And it's because you're headed up Metropolitan to that intersection and you have to make a left to be able to make a right to head northbound on Connecticut. And so activating Concord in this mix through the Phase 2 study could help to redesign that interchange to, it's already a failed intersection. That signal is turned off for the fact that it just doesn't work.
Okay. Yeah, and finally, I had encouraged Dr. Orland to call Delegate Carr, and I know you had 2 outreach meetings, and I would just encourage you to stay in close touch with that community and to the District 18 delegation, current and future, to make sure that they're all apprised and they're on the same message as to what they're telling their constituents.
I think we're gonna have to be together because most of those improvements that have been suggested are on state highways. So the
Sure.
question is, who pays and how does it get paid? Do we advance the money and try to get the money back, or do you guys help us buy it, or what?
Yeah, the earlier you can engage them, all the better.
And to the extent we're talking cut-through traffic, we do that a lot, of how to address cut-through traffic and make sure that we handle that. So my expectation is that if that's an issue, we'll come up with a solution for that problem. I think we're good on this one. Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
And the last item for the day is the same kind of review, but this time for the Tuckerman Lane Sidewalk and Bikeway Project in Bethesda. And again, as soon as JT's ready, he'll go through the presentation.
Okay, to save time on this one, it's the same staff and the same process. Different line on the map, in this case, master plan bikeway line on the map, but also in all of our facility planning bikeway specific projects, we look at pedestrian safety improvements for people walking as well up and down the corridor. So this is Tuckerman Lane. It's about 4 miles west to east from Falls all the way on the west to Old Georgetown, and I'll show you a little map there. Because it's such a long corridor, we actually broke it up into 4 pieces, and we've come back to that as well. So each of our cost recommendations, we broke up into 4 pieces as well. The piece on the west is predominated by residential communities and lots of schools. The second piece is the Cabin John Mall, the shopping center at the corner of 7 Locks and Tuckerman, and some other commercial uses along there as well. The third piece, segment 3, is really the piece through Cabin John Regional Park, and then underneath of 270 past Westlake Drive, and then the last piece is back to a more residential setting as you transition into the Rockville and White Flint area at Old Georgetown. So that's what we're talking about today. And that's what this stuff looks like, picture-wise. You've got a choke point here at the I-270 overpass, which adds some costs in figuring out how to get through there, and then the other end. So obviously, all of those things are things that people that live and work in that area want to get to, and the challenges are how do we get through that while minimizing our impacts, and especially in and around the park. So we came up with 4 alternatives. No build as existing conditions. Alternative 1, continuous conventional bike lanes, sidewalks on at least one side of the road, removing right-of-way for on-street parking on the west end. 1A is a modification of that. I'm going to skip through quickly to that. Alternative 2 is most consistent with the master plan and also the most expensive, but that is a full separated bike lanes on both sides, maintaining the travel lanes, maintaining the parking lanes, maintaining and adding a sidewalk on both sides. So that's a pretty wide cross-section, that alternative 2 that was most consistent.
How wide?
80? If you include the buffer and the slopes on either side. Alternative 3 is where we're, at this point, relatively consistent with council staff and planning board recommendations, and actually park staff as well. And what the cross-section there is conventional bicycle lanes, not the separated bike lane, a side path or a shared use path on one side, and a sidewalk in some key segments as well. So in this case, this is not wholly consistent with the master plan, but for good reason, and I'll have Stephen and even Chuck Hines is here from Parks. We can talk a little bit about that as well. The benefits are still there. You still get safer conditions for people walking and bicycling in the corridor.
The major differences between the master plan and this is what?
The separated bikeway on both sides, a sidewalk facility on both sides, is that alternative 2 versus alternative 3. You just have the shared use path on one side and just conventional bike lanes and sidewalks only on certain key areas. So it's really just.
Can I add a point on that?
Yeah.
What JT's saying is inconsistent with the draft bicycle plan that came over from the planning board. In your last work session on the bicycle master plan, we kind of brought this issue forward a little bit, and you agreed with basically changing that to what alternative 3 is. So we're doing both these things.
Now it is consistent with the bike.
It's consistent with T&E's recommendation on the bicycle
Of
master
course,
plan.
will.
A couple different alternatives to get underneath the underpass. We do think from an engineering perspective there is room actually to fit a facility up underneath of here, though that would cost more than just adding a buffer underneath of the.
Yeah. That'd be a mess.
To fit a sidewalk facility in between the slope up the bridge abutment. And in fact, the state highway has done this a number of cases around the state. So you can do it. You can fit something in there. The alternative at lower cost would just be to add basically bollards or flex posts or a raised median in between the travel lane and that shared shoulder. That would be a shared shoulder. So to sum all that up, I'm going to skip to this one. So from the minimum to the maximum cost-wise, we've got $10 to $50 million roughly. We didn't want to come back to y'all with another $50 million bikeway project. We didn't think that was right or fair or reasonable, especially when we've got a number of those that are already in the pipeline. So that's a lot of why we're recommending alternative 3 versus the fully consistent master plan alignment or alternative of alternate 2. So we're at about a $14 million cost for the recommended alternative for that 4 miles. Now, that being said, we've broken that up by cost into 4 segments. So there's potential that we could pick out a logical a segment, for example, the west piece that connects to the schools, and do that at a much lower cost. So again, rather than saying, here's a $4 million expensive $14 million project, let's look at it in pieces and see if there's a logical piece. So I've got those costs broken down as well. You do see a big property impact number, 179 with that. It's not displacements. It's those property impacts are temporary construction easements. I just wanted to call that out. And as I said, and actually, Stephen, if you want to walk through master plan consistency, you can.
Okay. So, well, you know, definitely with the changes made in the T&E committee, this project is very, very consistent with the bicycle master plan, and certainly totally consistent with the master plan of highways and transitways, and the North Bethesda Garrett Park master plan. What I will mention is that there are, as we show here, I think when the planning board was talking about alternative 2 versus alternative 3, the cost certainly was a consideration of the planning board as well, and we think that the benefits were far outweighed by the cost. So we're definitely in agreement on the support for alternative 3, and as well on the prioritizing of the western segment.
So we went to planning board and got their comments. This sums up where we're at. All of the planning board and planning staff comments and council staff comments are things that we absolutely can accommodate in phase 2 of facility planning.
Segment 1 is from Falls to Cabin.
So segment 1 is the furthest west, the piece over by the schools.
Falls.
Yeah.
Starts at Falls.
From Falls east to roughly the
Tuckerman?
Pepco right away, just west of 7 Locks.
Got it.
So the planning board did add a couple recommendations, and one is to add, right now in alternative 3, as what DOT outlined, the side path, the shared use path, did not go all the way through the Cabin John Park or underneath the I-270 connecting over this piece. So the planning board recommended that we add that in. So there is a little bit of increase in the cost to do that, and that would add that dotted line there. They also talked about potentially putting it all on one side. So those are 2 things that we can look at in phase 2 that certainly we agree with.
Serious hill right there. That
It does add some cost, because as you go through Cabin John Regional Park, to minimize the impacts to the streams and the park itself, it adds additional structure work and retaining walls as well, and to add cost to get underneath the I-270.
Yeah, it's not a little increase. I mean, again, GT was mentioning that the basic alternative 3 is about 14 million in today's dollars. Their guesstimate, and that's all it is at this stage, of adding that side path through the section we just mentioned would add nearly another 9 million. But I still think that ought to be studied in the next phase, because there may be a way of, doing it more economically, and just, get a better estimate before you make a final decision in a couple years as to what actually to do.
And I would add that 9 million would just be added to this piece right here, segment 3. So if we move ahead, if the direction at the next CIP time is to move ahead just with segment 1, you're not going to have to realize that $9 million increase. You only realize that $9 million increase if and when you move with segment 3.
Colleagues, anything to say with respect to this, or are we good? Ms. Florine.
Okay, so what do you say to Mr. Cochran's recommendations on this?
So both planning staff and DOT staff have reviewed Mr. Cochran's correspondence. We still support the conventional bike lanes versus the shoulders in general, though there's many things in his letter that we understand.
I don't know if the committee appreciates that this proposes eliminating the parking in front of Wooten High School.
On one side of the roadway.
Well, I mean, it's heavy parking. there. I guess it's kids, I don't know. I assume that's who parks there. Are people going to the parks?
On the west end, on segment 1.
That's segment 1.
So the community recommendation that we got correspondence on.
Churchill, I'm sorry, Churchill High School, sorry.
The community recommendation proposes maintaining the existing shoulders, which actually would maintain the existing parking as well.
Well, he suggests buffered bike lanes there.
Right.
I'm not sure what that
mentioned
means
that as
exactly, but,
There-
I actually agree with Mr. Corcoran about all this. I would, if they, to the extent we can keep the existing shoulders as much as we can, their shared use path, fine, and focus on the shoulders, because that achieves the same result. I bet you'd save a lot of money, too, under that approach.
So not necessarily. The two things to keep in mind with that is, one, if and when those shoulders are fully parked, whether it's at school time or on the weekend, then there is no on-street bike facility. So you're
You have to go
totally-
around them.
And
This is what
two
we do today.
is to realize, with respect to your costs, Council Florine, is one of the things, in order to fit that shared use path in some cases, we actually reduce the shoulder width, which is actually one of Mr. Cochran's concerns. So if we leave that shoulder there, that shared use path may actually move further out and result in potentially more right-of-way impact. So that's something we can review, but it's not necessarily a decrease in cost, because there might be
Okay.
more right-of-way impact.
Fair enough. So what is the the plan calls for 80 feet. What is the right-of-way now?
It varies from 35-ish to 60-ish.
So it's pretty narrow. So you're talking about,
JT, you don't have your mic on.
you're talking about a fair amount of land acquisition from individual property owners? Or is that all park stuff?
So with alternative 3, the only right-of-way impacts we see at this stage, at the conceptual stage, are temporary construction impacts and maybe some slivers here and there of one.
So you don't need the 80-foot right-of-way?
No, but in order to meet that, we're using some of the existing shoulder space. So we're pulling things in.
So you need more right-of-way in order to accommodate the wider shoulders, is that what you're
In
saying?
order to add the shared use path
And
outside the existing shoulders, we potentially would need more right-of-way.
Well, I agree with his approach to this stuff. I think, I don't know what's more expensive or not, but I do think the people who travel along Turkman Lane, their views should be kept in mind here, because that is how people ride along that stretch. And will continue to do no matter what. And I don't think, at any event, we can get away with eliminating that parking on both sides over by Churchill. The demand, it's amazing to me, and it's used a lot of the time. And it's a busy road. There are residents, of course, on one side, and kids on the other side, I guess, are park users there when they have games and everything. And the last thing you want is to force that into neighborhoods. So you're going to have a difficult time in moving, changing the community expectation over there. Or what are they going to do? You're just going to have more community uproar if that is what, just for the sake of the purity of a bike lane. I don't subscribe, I don't think that the juice is worth the squeeze in that respect. So I guess, what stage are we at? We're still the thinking about it stage?
We're basically saying, is it alternative 1, 2, or 3? And you could say alternative 3, but look at a couple of sub-options. One of the
Well, that's what I guess I would say, give some more thought to what Mr. Corcoran says.
We can do that within the
Yeah.
scope of Phase 2.
Thank you.
I think we're good.
So we'll say alternative 3 with the option of looking at retaining the shoulders rather than having a bike lane on the one side.
You don't have to do everything every place. You can be creative, right? You're brilliant people.
And both with this Phase 2 and with Summit Phase 2, we'll have additional public outreach.
Mr. Conklin looks like he wants to say something.
Yeah, it's unrelated to the current discussion. I know
Oh.
you've already made your action. I just wanted to introduce Tim Couples, who you already know as the county's Purple Line Transit Coordinator. Tim has been assigned the enviable responsibility of Division Chief for Transportation Engineering for the department, so he will be representing capital projects before
Ah,
you.
good for you. Good
Wanted
luck.
to make sure that you are aware of that.
Good luck.
He's the new Bruce Johnston. Bruce retired and is in charge of vertical development in Loudoun County. He's been doing horizontal all his life, now he's doing vertical.